You've really perfected the art of doing nothing, haven't you? Evan's voice was casual, but it sliced through me sharper than the wineglass stem I was holding. His comment floated across the dining table toward his sister Camille and her fiancé, who both smirked like they were in on some inside joke. We were sitting in Camille's impeccably renovated loft in downtown Seattle, surrounded by exposed brick mid-century furniture, and the faint smell of rosemary lamb from the oven. Outside, rain streaked the tall windows, the city lights blurring into gold and gray. I forced a laugh, pretending it didn't sting. What's that supposed to mean? Evan leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine. Just that you left that big Boston career behind to, live the easy life. Not everyone gets to make that choice. His tone dripped with condescension, as if I'd traded ambition for a Netflix subscription. Camille chuckled. Sounds kind of nice, honestly. I'd love to take a few years off. Years off? Evan raised an eyebrow at me. How long has it been now, Harp? 2.5? 3. I didn't answer. I focused on my plate, on the rosemary lamb that was quickly losing its flavor in my mouth. I could feel my cheeks heat, but I held my posture, the way I had in 100 corporate boardrooms when someone underestimated me. They didn't see the hours I spent hunched over my laptop in our loft, managing client accounts from a makeshift desk by the window. They didn't know I had signed 2 new contracts this month alone, worth more than Evan's quarterly bonus. To them, I was just the woman who'd left her job for love. A romantic gesture that apparently made me lazy by default. The conversation drifted on, but my mind stayed locked on that single phrase. Perfected the art of doing nothing. It wasn't just a joke. It was a story Evan had been telling about me for months. And in that moment, somewhere between the wine and the rain, I realized I was tired of being his favorite punchline. 3 years earlier, that same man had looked at me across a crowded Boston bar like I was the only person in the room. Evan had been in town for a conference, still wearing his suit jacket, his tie loosened just enough to look charming but not sloppy. He talked about architecture the way other men talked about vacations. Vivid, passionate, full of possibility. At the time, I was deep into my role as a senior brand strategist at a top marketing firm. My days were 12 hours long, my weekends often booked with client dinners or last-minute presentations. It was exhausting, but it was mine. I'd worked for every inch of it. Evan and I spent that weekend together, and when he flew back to Seattle, we stayed in touch. Long calls that stretched past midnight, text messages that made me smile in the middle of tense client meetings. 6 months later, he asked the question that would change my life. Do you think you could see yourself here? With me? It wasn't just about the city. It was about him. I pictured Pike Place Market, the ferries crossing Elliott Bay, rainy mornings with coffee in bed. More than that, I pictured the two of us building something together. A life, not just a romance squeezed into flight schedules and vacation days. So, I did what everyone told me not to do. I gave my notice at the firm, sold most of my furniture, and packed the rest into a moving truck. My boss looked at me like I'd lost my mind. My best friend asked if I was sure I wasn't throwing everything away. It's not giving something up, I told her. It's choosing something better. When I pulled into Seattle that cloudy September afternoon, Evan was waiting with flowers and a key to the loft we'd picked together. It felt like the beginning of something extraordinary. I didn't know then that beginnings and endings can feel exactly the same. It's everything in the middle that changes the story. Our loft was in Belltown, just a few blocks from the water. It had soaring ceilings, massive windows that rattled when the ferries passed, and an open kitchen that looked like it belonged in a cooking show. Evan had chosen it for the architectural character, but to me it felt like a stage. A place where we could perform the kind of life we'd always imagined. In the first few weeks, everything was new and romantic. We explored the city like tourists. Fresh oysters on the pier, Sunday mornings wandering through art galleries, evenings curled up with wine while the rain streaked down the glass. Evan introduced me to his friends as the Boston girl who came to the West Coast for love. And at first I thought it was sweet. I set up my small freelance business at the kitchen island, my laptop balanced between stacks of marketing proposals and a notebook full of sketches for my own branding agency. I'd kept a handful of clients from Boston who didn't care where I lived as long as I delivered results. In fact, I was working more hours than I'd planned. Late nights answering emails from East Coast time zones, early mornings editing ad copy before client calls. But no one saw that part. When Evan came home from work, my laptop was usually closed, dinner halfway done. He'd pour a drink, kiss my cheek and say something like, "Must be nice to work in pajamas." I'd laugh it off, telling myself he didn't mean anything by it. His mother, Lenora, was a different story. The first time we had dinner with her, she asked what I did in Seattle. When I explained I was freelancing, she tilted her head and said, "So, like a hobby?" As if the $12,000 project I was working on was something I could just abandon if I got bored. Those comments were easy enough to brush aside at first. I told myself I'd prove myself with time, that once my business grew, they'd see I wasn't just here to play house. And in the beginning I believed it. But in hindsight, I think the problem wasn't that they didn't know what I did. It was that they didn't want to know. The story where I'd given up my career to follow Evan was more flattering to him than the truth. That I was still ambitious, still earning, still building something that had nothing to do with him. It was easier for them if I stayed in the box they'd put me in. And for a while I let them. By our second year in Seattle, the loft felt less like a shared dream and more like a carefully curated set I was expected to maintain. I was the one who made sure the fridge was stocked before Evan's friends dropped by unannounced. The one who picked out the perfect wine for his firm's client dinners. The one who cleaned up the champagne glasses the next morning when everyone else had moved on. It wasn't that I minded doing those things. I liked creating a beautiful, welcoming space. But somewhere along the way that became my only role in their eyes. The Boston strategist who used to pitch to executives in glass-walled boardrooms had become to them, the girl who makes great charcuterie boards. And Evan didn't correct them. In fact, he leaned into it. At one rooftop party his colleague was hosting, I overheard him say, "Harper's living the dream. No 9 to 5, no stress. She just takes the occasional project to keep herself busy." His voice was warm, affectionate even, but the words landed like lead in my stomach. The occasional project he was referring to? A national rebrand for a major retail chain. The kind of contract agencies fight each other for. I'd been waking up at 5 a.m. to work with their East Coast team, spending hours tweaking every pixel of their online launch. And yet, in Evan's telling, I was just filling my afternoons between yoga and grocery runs. It wasn't just him either. Lenora had a way of asking questions that sounded like compliments until you thought about them later. "So what do you do all day while Evan's at work?" she'd ask over lunch, her tone light but her eyes sharp. "I work," I'd say, forcing a smile. "Oh, I just thought freelancing meant you could do whatever you want." Camille, his sister, was more blunt. One night over dinner she said, "You're lucky. If I didn't have to work, I'd be traveling and shopping all the time. What do you even spend your days on?" I knew they didn't see the 12-hour workdays, the constant juggling of clients in 3 time zones, the fact that I'd quietly paid for the trip to Aspen last winter when Evan's bonus came in lower than expected. I didn't tell them because some part of me believed it wasn't worth defending, that the results would speak for themselves eventually. But the thing about people who enjoy believing a certain story, they don't go looking for evidence to change it. One rainy evening as I sat at my kitchen desk, polishing a campaign presentation, I heard Evan on the phone in the other room. He was talking to one of his friends from college. His laugh was easy, confident. "Yeah man, she basically retired at 30. I've got the career, she's got the lifestyle. Works for both of us." I stared at my laptop screen, my fingers frozen over the keyboard. Retired. Lifestyle. Those weren't slips of the tongue. Those were the headlines he'd chosen for my life. The irony? I was earning almost as much as I had in Boston, just without the office politics or cross-country flights. The only thing I'd retired from was letting other people decide my worth. Or so I thought. It happened on a Thursday night in early spring, one of those damp Seattle evenings where the rain feels more like a constant mist. We'd been invited to dinner at Lenora's house, her famous family night, which usually meant a multi-course meal, too much wine, and at least one backhanded comment aimed in my direction. Lenora's dining room was straight out of an interior design magazine. Vaulted ceilings, soft pendant lighting, a table long enough to seat 12. The air smelled like lemon rosemary chicken, and a jazz playlist hummed softly in the background. I'd spent an extra hour getting ready, telling myself I wanted to look my best, but deep down I think I was bracing for impact. Halfway through the main course, between Lenora asking Camille about her latest promotion and Evan recounting some minor victory at work, the conversation turned to me. "So Harper," Lenora said, her tone sugar-sweet, "what's keeping you busy these days?" "More hobby projects." I set my fork down slowly, careful not to let the irritation show. Actually, I just wrapped a campaign for a national retailer. It's going to be their biggest launch in over a decade. Camille smiled faintly. Wow. So you do still work sometimes. Before I could respond, Evan chuckled and leaned back in his chair. Oh, come on, Harp. You know you've got it easy. You're basically the definition of a successful failure. The words landed like a slap. My breath caught in my throat. Around the table, Camille's fiancé let out a small laugh, and Lenora smirked like it was all in good fun. But I could feel the blood rushing to my face, my pulse pounding in my ears. Successful failure? I repeated, my voice quieter than I expected. Evan shrugged as if the phrase was self-explanatory. You were killing it in Boston, sure, but now you've traded all that stress for, what? Cozy mornings and the occasional gig? You're happy, but let's be honest, you're not really chasing anything anymore. It wasn't just the words. It was the way he said them. Like the years I'd spent building my own client list, managing contracts, and quietly paying for parts of our life didn't count because they weren't visible on a LinkedIn profile. I wanted to list every expense I'd covered, every late-night work session, every client who'd come back to me year after year because I delivered. I wanted to tell them that half the cozy mornings he was talking about had been spent on video calls with New York or London. But I didn't. Not because I couldn't, but because in that moment I saw something I couldn't unsee. Evan liked this story. His family liked this story. It made him the ambitious provider, the hero, the one whose success was unquestionable. Me. I was the charming accessory who'd given it all up for love. That wasn't an accident. By the time dessert was served, I'd decided something quietly, firmly, irrevocably. If they were going to insist on believing I was a failure, they could do it without my support. The next morning, I woke up to the gray Seattle light spilling through our bedroom windows. Evan was already gone, probably at the coffee shop he liked to stop at before work. His side of the bed was cool, untouched since he'd rolled out of it. I lay there for a few minutes, staring at the exposed beams above, replaying his words from the night before. Successful failure. It wasn't just an insult. It was a diagnosis, a label he felt comfortable stamping across my forehead in front of his family. By the time I got up, the decision had started to take shape in my mind. Not the loud, dramatic kind of decision you announce in a fight, but the kind you make in the quiet when no one's watching. I padded into the kitchen, made myself coffee, and sat down at the little desk by the window where I did most of my work. From there, I could see the ferry sliding across Elliott Bay, the gulls trailing in its wake. My laptop hummed to life, the same machine I'd used to generate hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue for clients. Revenue Evan never mentioned when talking about what I did all day. I opened my accounting software. Line after line of invoices stared back at me. Ad campaigns, product launches, brand overhauls. I thought about how many of those payments had quietly kept our life running. The mortgage payments that had come from my account when his bonuses were delayed, the groceries, the travel, even part of his student loan when he'd forgotten to pay it 1 month. And yet, somehow in his mind I was still coasting. I didn't slam the laptop shut or delete any files in a blaze of glory. Instead, I began making a list. Every joint expense that had my name on it. Every auto payment linked to my account. Every subscription, utility, and bill that silently drew from the money I earned while he played the role of sole provider. The list was longer than I'd expected. By the time Evan got home that evening, I'd already transferred the first 2 bills, the internet and the electric, to his card. He didn't notice. He kissed me on the cheek, told me about his day, and collapsed onto the couch while I made dinner. He had no idea that, one step at a time, I was removing myself from the story he'd been telling about us. No announcement. No warning. Just the slow, careful unwinding of a life that for too long had been built on a lie. Over the next few weeks, I became a quiet strategist in my own life. By day, I worked on client projects, campaign timelines, media buys, creative briefs. By night, I worked on my exit. The first thing to go was the SUV lease. It was in Evan's name, but the payments had been coming out of my account since day one. I called the leasing company, explained that I would no longer be responsible, and set the termination date for the end of the month. When I told Evan, I framed it as simplifying our finances. He nodded, distracted, already thinking about which new model he wanted next. Next, I switched the mortgage autopay from my account to his. He didn't even blink, just said, "Sure babe, I'll handle it," like he was doing me a favor. The truth was, the mortgage alone was going to hit him harder than he realized. The utilities, the streaming services, the HOA fees. Each one migrated to his name with a few clicks. It felt almost surgical, each change another thread snipped from the web I'd been holding together. Meanwhile, I quietly accepted a job offer from a creative agency in Portland. Senior position, higher salary than I'd ever earned in Boston, relocation stipend, health benefits. The kind of offer people move across the country for, and I was about to do it again. The plan was simple. I'd line everything up, wait for the right moment, and then leave. No fight, no drawn-out conversations. Just gone. Some nights, lying awake next to Evan, I'd wonder if I was overreacting. Maybe this was just about a few careless comments, a little family teasing taken too far. But then I'd remember the smirk on his face when he called me a successful failure, the way the words rolled off his tongue like a well-rehearsed punchline. No, I wasn't overreacting. I was finally reacting. By the time the last of the bills was transferred, my move date was set, my new apartment secured, and my resignation from this life already signed in my heart. All that was left was to deliver it without giving him the chance to edit the ending. The morning I left was so ordinary it almost felt wrong. No slammed doors, no shouted accusations. Just the soft patter of rain against the windows and the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. Evan had left early for a site visit. His navy scarf was still draped over the back of a chair, his half-empty mug by the sink. I stood there for a moment staring at those small pieces of him and realized they didn't feel like home anymore. Just artifacts of a life I was stepping out of. I moved quietly, methodically. The moving van had been booked under my friend Leah's name weeks earlier. She pulled into the alley behind the loft at exactly 8 a.m., her old green Subaru blocking the view from the street. We worked in silence, loading boxes I'd been packing in secret for weeks. My books, my clothes, my laptop, the framed photos I actually cared about. I left behind the designer kitchenware Evan's mother had insisted on, the heavy furniture he'd chosen, even the velvet armchair I'd secretly loved. They belonged to that version of us. By noon the loft was stripped of me. Only my desk remained, a clean rectangle of wood where I'd spent countless hours working on campaigns no one here believed were real. I left a single envelope on it. Not a letter, just a folded sheet with my forwarding address for any stray mail. No explanations. No apologies. When Leah and I locked the door for the last time, I felt an odd stillness settle over me. Not joy, not sadness. Just the quiet understanding that I was finally stepping out of the role I'd been cast in. The drive to Portland was a blur of wet highways and half-finished coffee. My phone buzzed once. A calendar reminder for a dinner with Evan's family that evening. And I silenced it without looking. By the time I pulled into my new apartment complex, the rain had stopped. The air smelled different here, cleaner somehow. I carried the first box inside and set it down in the middle of the empty living room. For the first time in years, the space around me was entirely mine. No one's narrative to live up to. No one's expectations to shrink under. Just me, four walls, and the beginning of a story I would write myself. The first call came less than 24 hours after I left. I was sitting cross-legged on the floor of my new apartment, eating takeout Thai straight from the container, when my phone lit up with Evan's name. I didn't answer. A minute later it rang again, this time his mother. Then Camille. Then Evan again. Each call rolled to voicemail, my phone vibrating against the hardwood like a trapped insect. By the next morning, there were 6 missed calls and 3 voice messages. I played them on speaker as I unpacked dishes. Hey Harp, it's me. Just wondering where you are? Call me. Evan's voice was light, almost casual, like he didn't want to admit he was concerned. The second message was shorter. Babe, did you change something with the internet bill? It's saying the payment failed. Call me back. The third came from Lenora, clipped and frosty. Harper, this isn't funny. Evan says you moved out. We need to talk. Immediately. By that evening the tone had shifted. My voicemail pinged with a message from Camille. Evan's freaking out. His credit card got declined at lunch. What's going on? I sat on my couch, surrounded by half-open boxes, and let the messages pile up. There was a certain grim satisfaction in knowing they were only beginning to feel the ripple effects. The mortgage payment was due in 3 days. The SUV lease would be terminated at the end of the month. The utilities would be billed to Evan's card for the first time in years. I knew the math. Without my contributions, their comfortable narrative would start to unravel. And quickly. By the third day, my call log was absurd. 22 missed calls, 10 texts, and an email from Evan titled simply, "We need to talk." I didn't respond to that one either. Instead, I closed my laptop on a finished client project, ordered myself flowers for my new place, and poured a glass of wine. Somewhere in Seattle, they were realizing that this successful failure they'd been mocking had been keeping the lights on, literally. And I was just getting started. It was on the fourth day that I finally picked up. Not because I felt guilty, but because I wanted to hear the panic in his voice without a voicemail buffer. The phone rang twice before Evan answered, his tone a mix of relief and accusation. "Harper." Finally. "What the hell is going on?" I leaned back against my kitchen counter, letting him fill the silence. "The mortgage payment bounced. The electric company's threatening to cut us off." "My car payment." "Your car payment," I corrected softly. He paused. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm no longer paying for it. Or the mortgage. Or the utilities. Or the internet. Or anything else with my name on it." There was a long, stunned silence on the other end, broken only by the faint hum of city traffic through my open window. "Wait, you were paying for those?" His voice cracked on the last word. I almost laughed. "Who did you think was covering them, Evan? The bills didn't magically pay themselves." I thought it was from our joint account." "Our joint account hasn't had more than $500 in it for the last year," I said, my tone steady. "That account was a prop, Evan. Just like the story you told your family about me doing nothing all day." "I didn't mean it like that." "Yes, you did. You liked that version of me. The one who made you look like the sole provider. It made for a better narrative at dinner parties, didn't it?" "Harper, come on, this is ridiculous. We can figure this out." "No, you can figure it out. I already have." His voice shifted then, losing its edge, dipping into something that sounded suspiciously like fear. "Look, I'm sorry, okay? Just come home. We'll talk." I glanced around at my sunlit kitchen, the half-unpacked boxes, the new job contract pinned to my fridge. "I am home." Before he could respond, I ended the call. For the first time since I'd arrived in Seattle 3 years earlier, the silence that followed felt like mine. The next week was a symphony of desperation. My phone became a constant source of vibrations. Calls, texts, voicemails, even a couple of emails from addresses I didn't recognize but knew instantly were his family. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I settled into my new routine. Mornings started with coffee on my small balcony, the air in Portland fresher, lighter somehow. I'd log into my agency's system, join a creative briefing, and spend my day immersed in projects where my input was valued and my skills respected. Every task felt like another brick laid in the foundation of my own life. A life with no one standing over it, claiming ownership. Meanwhile, the messages from Seattle grew more frantic. From Camille, "The power got shut off yesterday. Are you happy now?" From Lenora, "Evan is exhausted. He's working extra hours to cover everything. Please, Harper, you've made your point." From Evan, "I can't believe you'd just leave like this after everything. I thought we were a team." That was rich. By the second week, the tone shifted again. Gone was the anger, replaced by something softer, more calculated. Evan left a voicemail saying he missed me, that he'd been thinking about how unfair he'd been, that maybe he hadn't realized how much I'd done. He stopped short of an actual apology, but the implication was there. If I came back, things would change. But that's the thing about people who like the stories they tell. They might edit a few lines under pressure, but they rarely change the ending. One rainy Thursday evening, I sat on my couch, glass of wine in hand, and listened to all the voicemails in order. They played like a timeline of collapse. Disbelief, anger, bargaining, and finally the edge of acceptance. The life they'd built on the idea of me being a successful failure had crumbled the moment I stopped playing my part. And I wasn't about to audition for a comeback. It was almost a month after I left when I saw her. I'd just come home from work, the late spring air in Portland warm enough to walk without a jacket. My key was halfway to the door when I noticed a familiar figure sitting in the lobby, Lenora. Her posture was as perfect as ever, but there was a stiffness to it, like she'd been holding herself together for too long. "Harper," she said, standing as if we were old friends meeting by chance. I didn't move closer. "What are you doing here? I needed to talk to you in person. You weren't answering my calls." Her eyes flicked around the sleek, modern lobby, taking in the plants, the art on the walls. This is nice. You've done well for yourself. I opened the door and stepped inside. You came all this way to compliment my apartment? She hesitated, then followed me in when I didn't stop her. Inside, she took a slow lap, her gaze lingering on the view from my balcony, the Willamette River catching the late sunlight. We lost the house, she said finally. Her voice was flat, but her hands twisted in front of her like she was wringing water from them. Evan's been struggling. Camille helps when she can, but she trailed off. I leaned against the counter, waiting. We were wrong, she said, and for a moment her voice cracked. About you. About what you did for us. We didn't realize. You didn't want to realize, I cut in gently. It didn't fit the story you liked telling. She looked down. I came here to ask if you'd consider. No, my answer was calm, but it landed between us like a stone. I'm not your safety net anymore, Lenora. I have a life here. A job. People who see me for what I actually do, not for the role they want me to play. She swallowed hard, nodding, but her eyes said she'd hoped for a different ending. When she left, the apartment felt even quieter than usual. Not empty, peaceful. The kind of quiet that comes when you've shut a door and know you'll never open it again. I poured myself a glass of wine, stepped out onto the balcony and watched the sun slip behind the river. Somewhere far away, their lives were still unraveling. Mine, for the first time in years, was just beginning. 2 months passed before I heard anything new, and when it came, it wasn't from Evan or Lenora. It was a text from Marcy, a mutual friend we'd met through his architecture firm. I ran into Camille today. He says things have been rough. You okay? Rough was an understatement. According to Marcy, Evan had sold the SUV, sublet the loft, and was now renting a small condo in a neighborhood his mother once called up and coming, which was Lenora's polite way of saying not somewhere she'd ever live. The firm had cut his hours after a big client pulled out, and the debt he'd been juggling caught up with him fast. Camille had moved in with her fiancé to save money. Lenora had quietly taken a part-time job at a boutique in Queen Anne, something she swore she'd never do. I read the message twice, feeling, not satisfaction exactly, but a strange sense of symmetry. This was what happened when the scaffolding you relied on disappeared. You learned whether the structure could stand on its own. I didn't text back right away. Instead, I walked to the cafe near my office, ordered a latte and opened my laptop. My calendar was full. Campaign strategy meetings, client calls, a dinner with my new team that Friday. This life, my life, didn't leave much space for keeping tabs on Seattle. Still, I couldn't help picturing Evan in that condo pacing the floor, wondering how things had changed so quickly. Wondering, maybe for the first time, how much of his provider image had been propped up by the woman he'd called a successful failure. And maybe realizing the answer was all of it. It was late August when the email came. The subject line read, "Let's talk for real this time." It was from Evan. I almost deleted it without opening, but curiosity won. The message was surprisingly short. Harper, I know I messed up. I said things I can't take back. I didn't understand what you were doing for us, and I can see now how much I took that for granted. I want to explain myself. In person. Can we meet for dinner next week? My treat. I stared at the screen for a long time, my cursor hovering over the reply button. I could almost hear his voice, see him leaning across the table at some dimly lit restaurant, rehearsing apologies he hoped would sound sincere enough to undo years of disrespect. But the thing about apologies is that they're only as meaningful as the change that follows them, and I didn't need to meet him to know that change hadn't come. His narrative might have cracked, but I doubted he'd stopped looking for someone else to play the supporting role in it. Instead of replying, I closed my laptop and got ready for my own dinner. Not with Evan, but with Naomi and Jenna from my new team. We'd been working late on a campaign, and they'd insisted on treating me to sushi as a thank you for pulling together the pitch deck on a tight deadline. At the restaurant, we laughed over misordered roles and inside jokes about our clients. No one here saw me as an accessory or a kept woman. They saw me as the person who delivered results, who worked hard, who added value. On the way home, I passed a couple walking arm in arm, the man carrying an umbrella for both of them. For a moment, I thought of Evan and that rainy September when I first arrived in Seattle. But the thought passed quickly, like a cloud drifting over the moon. Some things didn't need revisiting, no matter how polite the invitation. The real closure didn't come from Evan. It came unexpectedly from Aunt Marianne, Lenora's older sister, a woman I'd only met twice at family gatherings. She called on a Sunday morning while I was watering my balcony plants. "Harper, sweetheart, I hope I'm not intruding," she began, her voice warm but careful. I heard what happened. I thought you should know a few things." She told me Evan had moved back in with Lenora after his condo lease ended, something he'd sworn he'd never do. The boutique where Lenora worked had cut her hours, and Camille had stopped visiting entirely after a falling out over money. "They're not doing well," Marianne said gently. "And your name comes up a lot. Regret is a regular guest in that house now." I leaned against the balcony railing, looking out at the rippling water below. "That's their regret to carry," I said. "I know. I'm not calling to change your mind. I'm calling because I think you should hear, from someone who isn't them, that you did the right thing. They treated you like you didn't matter, Harper. And you finally showed them you did." For a moment I didn't trust myself to speak. I'd spent so long untangling my worth from their perception that hearing it validated, even from a distance, caught me off guard. "Thank you," I said finally. I needed to hear that. After we hung up, I stood there in the morning sun, the city humming softly around me, and realized something. I no longer felt the urge to check on them, to wonder if they'd learned their lesson. Whatever happened in that house, it was no longer my story. My story was here, in the job I loved, the friends I'd made, the quiet apartment filled with things I'd chosen for myself. And for the first time since leaving Boston, I felt completely, unmistakably free. 3 months later, I was sitting on the beach in Cannon Beach, Oregon, watching the tides slide in under a pale autumn sky. My laptop was closed beside me, a finished campaign proposal waiting to be sent. I'd driven out here alone for the weekend just because I could. My phone buzzed. An email from my manager, offering me the lead on a major West Coast account. The kind of project that would have been fought over in Boston with weeks of office politics and jockeying. Here it was simply, "We think you're the best person for this. Wanted?" I smiled and typed back one word. "Yes." As I hit send, I thought back to the woman who had stepped off that U-Haul 3 years ago, full of hope and ready to build a life with Evan. I thought about every little compromise I'd made, every joke I'd swallowed, every moment I'd let someone else's version of my life become louder than my own voice. Leaving hadn't been about revenge. It had been about reclaiming my story, and realizing I didn't owe anyone the right to tell it for me. The wind picked up, cool and salty, and I pulled my sweater tighter around me. Somewhere in Seattle they were still piecing their lives together. Maybe they'd change. Maybe they wouldn't. But either way, it wasn't my responsibility to care. The ocean stretched wide and endless in front of me, and for the first time in years, so did the future. I stood, brushing sand from my jeans, and started walking toward the water. Not away from something, but toward everything that was mine. A year after I left Seattle, my life felt like it belonged to someone else. Someone braver, steadier, and infinitely more certain of her own worth. The Portland apartment had become more than just a place to sleep. It was mine in every sense. The walls lined with photos from trips I'd taken, the shelves filled with books I'd actually had time to read, the balcony overflowing with plants that thrived under my care. Work had taken off in ways I couldn't have imagined. That West Coast account I'd accepted on the beach turned into a career-defining project. The campaign was so successful that the client signed a 3-year contract with the agency, and I was promoted to creative director 6 months later. My salary had nearly doubled, but more importantly, my ideas carried weight. People listened when I spoke, and not because of who I was with, but because of what I could do. My personal life had changed too. I'd started dating Owen, a travel photographer who split his time between Portland and the Pacific Islands. He loved my work, asked about my projects, and bragged to his friends about my career in a way Evan never had, not to elevate himself but because he was genuinely proud. One Saturday morning, as we drank coffee on the balcony, Owen handed me a small envelope. Inside was a plane ticket to New Zealand for 3 weeks, he said, grinning. "You can work from anywhere, right?" I laughed, remembering the early days in Seattle when working remotely had been used as proof that I wasn't really working at all. Now it was proof of the freedom I'd built for myself. Somewhere in the distance, literally and figuratively, Seattle kept moving without me. Every once in a while, a mutual friend would mention seeing Evan at some networking event, quieter than he used to be, or hearing that Lenora had finally sold the last of the things from the loft to cover debts. But those stories didn't land the way they once might have. They weren't chapters in my book anymore. They were footnotes in someone else's. And I had no interest in turning back to read them. It was late evening in Queenstown, the lake reflecting a ribbon of gold from the sinking sun. Owen was off photographing the skyline, and I sat alone on the hotel balcony, a blanket around my shoulders and my laptop balanced on my knees. I'd just wrapped a video call with my team in Portland, signing off on a campaign that was set to launch the following week. When I closed the laptop, the silence felt different than it had a year ago. Back then, quiet had felt like a void, an empty space left behind when I cut myself loose from the life I thought I wanted. Now it felt like air. Breathable. Expansive. I thought about the word Evan had thrown at me that night at his mother's table. Failure. How easily it had rolled off his tongue, how comfortable he'd been framing my choices as a punchline. 4 months after, I'd told myself my leaving was revenge. And maybe in the beginning it was. Maybe I wanted him, all of them, to feel the absence of what I'd given. But sitting there with the soft sound of waves lapping against the shore and my passport tucked into my bag for tomorrow's hike in Fjordland, I knew better. The real revenge hadn't been making them struggle. It had been refusing to struggle for their approval. It had been waking up in a home that was mine, building a career on my own terms, loving someone who saw my ambition as something to celebrate instead of diminish. It had been replacing the endless loop of prove yourself with the quiet certainty that I already had. I pulled the blanket tighter, breathing in the crisp air, and realized something. Freedom wasn't the absence of responsibility, it was the choice of where to place it. I wasn't a successful failure. I was simply successful. And for the first time in my life, that was enough.